I'm going to read a few pages from the prologue to give you a feel for the book, because I think the words need to be in the room with us. And then I'll talk about our man and Richard Holbrooke, and then Chris and I are going to have a conversation. Holbrooke? Yes, I knew him. I can't get his voice out of my head. I still hear it saying, "You haven't read that book, you really need to read it." Or saying, "I feel, and I hope this doesn't sound too self-satisfied, that in a very difficult situation where nobody has the answer, I at least know what the overall questions and moving parts are." Saying, "Gotta go, Hillary is on the line." That voice, calm, nasal, a trace of older New York, a sing-song cadence when he was being playful, but always doing something to you. Cajoling, flattering, bullying, seducing, needling, analyzing, one-upping you. Applying continuous pressure like a strong underwater current. So that by the end of a conversation, even 2 minutes on the phone, you found yourself far out from where you had started, unsure how you got there, and encased within it the sleepless brain. His feet were so far from his trunk that as his body wore down and the blood stopped circulating properly, they swelled up and became marbled, red and white, like steak. He had special shoes made and carried extra socks in his leather attaché case, sweating through half a dozen pairs a day, stripping them off on long flights and draping them over his seat pocket in first class, or else cramming used socks next to the classified documents in his briefcase. He wrote his book about ending the war in Bosnia, the place in history that he always craved, though it was never enough, with his feet planted in a Brookstone shiatsu foot massager. One morning he showed up late for a meeting in the Secretary of State's suite at the Waldorf Astoria in his stocking feet, shirt untucked and fly half-zipped, padding around the room and picking grapes off a fruit basket while Madeleine Albright's furious stare tracked his every move. During a video conference call from the UN mission in New York, his feet were propped up on a chair so that while down in the White House Situation Room, their giant distortion completely filled the wall screen and so disrupted the meeting that President Clinton's national security advisor finally ordered a military aide to turn off the video feed. Holbrooke put his feet up anywhere, in the White House, on other people's desks and coffee tables, for relief and for advantage. Near the end, it seemed as if all his troubles were collecting in his feet. Atrial fibrillation, marital tension, thwarted ambition, conspiring colleagues, hundreds of thousands of air miles, corrupt foreign leaders, a war that would not yield to the relentless force of his will. But at the other extreme from his feet, the ice blue eyes were on perpetual alert. Their light told you that his intelligence was always awake and working. They captured nearly everything and gave almost nothing away. Like one-way mirrors, they gazed inward, not outward. I never knew anyone quicker to size up a room, an adversary, a newspaper article, a set of variables in a complex situation, even his own imminent death. The ceaseless appraising told of a manic spirit churning somewhere within the low voice and languid limbs. Once in the 1980s, he was walking down Madison Avenue when an acquaintance passed him and called out, "Hi, Dick." Holbrooke watched the man go by and then turned to his companion. I wonder what he meant by that. Yes, his curly hair never obeyed the comb, and his suit was always looked rumpled, and he couldn't stay off the phone or TV, and he kept losing things, and he ate as much food as fast as he could, once slicing open the tip of his nose on a clamshell and bleeding through a pair of cloth napkins. Yes, he was in almost every way a disorderly presence, but his eyes never lost focus. So much thought, so little inwardness. He could not be alone. He might have had to think about himself. Maybe that was something he couldn't afford to do. Leslie Gelb, Holbrooke's friend of 45 years and recipient of multiple daily phone calls, would butt into a monologue and ask, "What's Obama like?" Holbrooke would give a brilliant analysis of the president. "How do you think you affect Obama?" Holbrooke had nothing to say. Where did it come from, that blind spot behind his eyes that masked his inner life? It was a great advantage over the rest of us because the propulsion from idea to action was never broken by self-scrutiny. It was also a great vulnerability. And finally, it was fatal. I can hear the voice saying, "It's your problem now, not mine." You will have heard that he was a monstrous egotist. It's true. It's even worse than you've heard. I'll explain as we go on. He offended countless people, and they didn't forget. And since so many of them swallowed their hurt, after he was gone, it was usually the first thing out of their mouth, if his name came up, as it invariably did. How he once told a colleague, "I lost more money in the market today than you make in a year." How he bumped an elderly survivor couple from the official American bus to Auschwitz on the 50th anniversary of its liberation, added himself to the delegation alongside Elie Wiesel, and left the weeping couple to beg Polish guards to let them into the camp so they wouldn't miss the ceremony. How he lobbied for the Nobel Peace Prize. That kind of thing. All the time. As if he needed to discharge a surplus of self every few hours to maintain his equilibrium. And the price he paid was very high. He destroyed his first marriage and his closest friendship. His defects of character cost him his dream job as Secretary of State, the position for which his strengths of character eminently qualified him. You can't untangle these things. I used to think that if Holbrooke could just be fixed, a dose of self-restraint, a flash of inward light, he could have done anything. But that's an illusion. We are wholly ourselves. If you cut out the destructive element, you would kill the thing that made him almost great. As a member of the class of lesser beings who aspire to a good life but not a great one, who find the very notion both daunting and distasteful, I can barely fathom the agony of that almost. Think about it. The nonstop schedule, the calculation of every dinner table, the brain that burned all day and night, and the knowledge buried so deep he might have only sensed it as a physical ache that he had come up short of his own impossible exaltation. I'm trying to think what to tell you now that you have me talking. There's too much to say, and it all comes crowding in at once. His ambition, his loyalty, his cruelty, his fragility, his betrayals, his wounds, his wives, his girlfriends, his sons, his lunches. By dying, he stood up 100 people, including me. He could not be alone. If you're still interested, I can tell you what I know from the beginning. I wasn't one of his close friends, but over the years I made a study of him. You ask, why? Not because he was extraordinary, though he was, and might have rivaled the record of his post-war heroes if he and America had been in their prime together. Not because he was fascinating, though he was, and right this minute, somewhere in the world, 14 people are talking about him. I won't relate this story for his sake. No, we want to see and feel what happened to America during Holbrooke's life. And we can see and feel more clearly by following someone who was almost great, because his quest leads us deeper down the alleyways of power than the usual famous subjects, whom he knew, all of them. And his boisterous struggling lays open more human truths than the composed annals of the great. This was what Les Gelb must have meant when he said just after his friend's death, "Far better to write a novel about Richard Holbrooke than a biography, let alone an obituary." What's called the American Century was really just a little more than half a century, and that was the span of Holbrooke's life. It began with the Second World War and the creative bursts that followed, the United Nations, the Atlantic Alliance, containment, the free world, and it went through dizzying lows and highs until it expired the day before yesterday. The thing that brings on doom to great powers and great men, is it simple hubris or decadence and squander, a kind of inattention, loss of faith, or just the passage of years? At some point, that thing set in, and so we're talking about an age gone by. It wasn't a golden age. There was plenty of folly and wrong, but I already miss it. The best about us was inseparable from the worst. Our feeling that we could do anything gave us the Marshall Plan and Vietnam, the peace at Dayton, and the endless Afghan war. Our confidence and energy, our reach and grasp, our excess and blindness, they were not so different from Holbrooke's. He was our man. That's the reason to tell you this story. That's why I can't get his voice out of my head. Thank you. So as Chris said, he died in December 2010. And a few weeks later, his widow, Kati Martin, gave me his personal papers with no strings attached on the condition that I would write as good a book as I can about him. So I took those papers without really knowing why or what I was doing. They were available, I saw a chance, I took them, and within a week, these giant black filing cabinets were sitting in my home office in Brooklyn so that I couldn't get the door all the way open, I couldn't reach some of my favorite books. Holbrooke moved in on me and stayed there for 7 years. And the whole time, I had this sense of him in my room watching me, shaking his head. Who are you to be reading my private letters and diaries? And what the hell is taking you so long anyway? So what was in the papers? Letters to his first wife from South Vietnam in the early 60s, his intimate thoughts while negotiating the end of Bosnia that he recorded on a little microcassette recorder as a diary, and at the very end of his life did the same thing when he was working on Afghanistan. But what was taking me so long was that I did not know how to write the book. Honestly, I felt at the bottom of it, who cares? Who cares? And any writer should have that thought at the very front of his or her mind, that at any moment the reader is ready to abandon it because it's not worth it. How do you make it worth it? He was already beginning to fade by the time I began writing in 2016. And why write a biography about this man? Why write any biography? They're boring. I mean, I find biographies often boring because everything has been crammed into them regardless of its importance, as if the biographer has a duty to include every last detail. Janet Malcolm, the great essayist, described biographers as being like burglars who break into the house of someone who's dead, ransack their dresser for every last valuable item, and then expect to be praised by the reading public for their industrious work and their exhaustive research. So honestly, I didn't want to write a biography, but I had kind of taken on a biography, and that was a real problem. I was in a sort of panic. And one day I was driving on a interstate in Connecticut, and inspiration came, which never happens to me. I never hear a voice, but I heard a voice. And the voice said, "Holbrooke?" Yes, I knew him. Who was that speaking? I had no idea. It sounded like something utterly different from the normal narrator of a biography. And I was sort of alarmed, like, I can't do that, but I was also intrigued. Why not? Why can't I do that? And it began to occur to me that if I followed that voice, which excited me, it actually was the first real literary energy that I had on this project. If I followed that voice, I could tell this story. And I could tell it as if I were writing a novel, as if I were following Les Gelb's advice and writing a novel in which Richard Holbrooke was this main, powerful, mesmerizing, infuriating, complex character. And the narrator, the voice of the narrator, would not quite be me. I think the voice you just heard is not really my voice. I think of it as the voice of someone older, more knowing, wiser, more experienced, someone who just somehow knew the story. And throughout the telling of it, you never found out how he knew it, because there's no sign of any of my research in the telling of the story. It's all in the back in the notes, but in the narrative, there's just a story without interviews, without documents, because that's what a novel feels like. I wanted this narrator to have the freedom to be able to say, do you mind if we hurry through the early years, which is the first line of the first chapter after the prologue, because I didn't feel like telling you everything about Holbrooke in high school, and I actually felt you probably didn't want to know. It seemed a little bit like a pointless exercise. So, and had the freedom also to give you some quick asides about foreign policy makes no sense, and a paragraph about why it makes no sense, as Chris was suggesting earlier, in the way that a biographer wouldn't be able to do. It would break the rules in which a biographer has to maintain a kind of studied neutrality and be hovering above it all. Instead, the narrator would be like a real person with an interest and a point of view, an opinion, not a judgment. He wouldn't have a kind of petty gotcha judgmentalism, but he would have a wisdom about Holbrooke that came from years of experience that I don't have. And he would be telling you the story like a yarn, a very long yarn that you're listening to over a very long night, maybe over a bottle of bourbon. I felt that Holbrooke himself demanded a book like that because he was too big for a conventional biography. He would have overwhelmed it. He needed some resistance, some tension, and the narrator would give him some tension. The cliche larger than life doesn't begin to describe him. His achievements, his failings, and his abiding value could only be brought to life on the page through the eyes of a narrator who had seen a span of history that I have not, and who had a keenly personal knowledge of America's dreams and defeats and battles with itself, and who could fully evoke Holbrooke as a poignant emblem of that America. So in other words, everything in this is true except the narrator, who's an invention. So what do I mean by larger than life? Who was Holbrooke? He served under every Democratic president, from John F. Kennedy to Barack Obama. He was, Hillary Clinton once told me, the Zelig of American foreign policy. He showed up everywhere. He was always in the middle of the action. Here he is in the middle of the action in South Vietnam. It looks like he's having a pretty good time. And in fact, he relished his first overseas post. He's 22 years old. He is the senior American civilian in an entire province in the Mekong Delta in the year 1963. And it's there that the war is at its most intense, and the Viet Cong is beginning to show that it can win. And Holbrooke, who was posted to a little town in the Delta, immediately saw two things. One, we were losing because we were using conventional firepower tactics against an insurgency, a rural insurgency, and killing a lot of civilians and turning the survivors into sympathizers with the enemy. And the second thing he saw was that we were lying to ourselves. Firsthand, he saw how assessments coming up from the military in his area to Saigon and from Saigon to Washington were full of optimistic reports that weren't true, and he knew they weren't true. It's one thing to see that. It's another to really take it in and think about it and even act on it. But he had the intelligence and I would say the moral courage to do that. At age 22, he went out into the world thinking that the United States was always on the side of good. And he actually continued to believe that in Vietnam. It took several years for him to actually doubt the war itself. He went through a series of painful steps of disillusionment before he got to that point. And I think that's natural for someone inside government. But what's remarkable is how young he was and how much he saw and how much he understood. And in a way, I feel that that first year was Holbrooke at his very best. He was doing classic counterinsurgency work, both with Vietnamese peasants and with the Vietnamese army. And he was also networking, operating, moving up the ladder of the American government, often on the tennis court. Here he is on a Saigon tennis court with General Maxwell Taylor on the left. He also played tennis against William Westmoreland, and then finally in Washington against Bobby Kennedy. And tennis became, it's a major theme of the book, by the way, and it became Holbrooke's way of impressing powerful men, showing them what he was made of, and ingratiating himself. And he had a real talent for finding what he thought of as sort of the great men of the American century and making himself indispensable to them. Not by flattering, although he did flatter a lot, but honestly by telling them what he thought and hoping that they would respect him for that. And some of them did. He spent 3 years in Vietnam and then returned to Washington, where he served in the Johnson White House. Here he is meeting the president for the first time, and at this meeting telling Lyndon Johnson, basically, you don't know what is happening in Vietnam. I've been there, I know. He wasn't afraid to do that. He also became a fixture of dinner parties in Georgetown and got to know Averell Harriman, who had negotiated Lend-Lease with Britain and been the ambassador to the Soviet Union during World War II. And it was Averell Harriman who became Holbrooke's real patron and put him on the delegation at the Paris peace talks in '68, the first face-to-face negotiations with the North Vietnamese, from which Holbrooke learned a lot of lessons about how not to negotiate, because those talks went nowhere. And soon after Richard Nixon became president, Holbrooke left government for a few years and did other things. For example, he left his wife and children. He became a swinger in Washington. You can kind of tell. He edited Foreign Policy magazine. He began to climb up the Washington greasy pole. There's one moment when he was on a date with a woman about 10 years younger, and he asked her to marry him, and she was a bit taken aback because he was still married and she was still married. So in order to stall him, she said, well, how do you see yourself in 5 years? And he said, I'm going to be the next Henry Kissinger. Well, this young woman actually knew Henry Kissinger pretty well, and that was the end of that relationship. Kissinger and Holbrooke regarded each other throughout their careers with mutual contempt and vitriol, but with a certain grudging admiration. Holbrooke thought Kissinger cynical and immoral, but he also respected him for having a real strategic mind, which Holbrooke didn't have. And as for Kissinger, he once said of Holbrooke, he's the most viperous man in this town, which is quite something coming from Henry Kissinger. At the age of 35, Holbrooke became Jimmy Carter's Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, the youngest ever. So he was on his way up fast. But he quickly found out that at that height, we're near the treetops, the very top of the trees, things get really brutal in government because the levels of ambition and competition and the amount of power being exercised, especially in the superpower, is so intense that it's a real death struggle. Here he is on the Great Wall in China, being part of the American delegation that negotiated the normalization of relations with the People's Republic, one of the most important breakthroughs of the last few decades. In the middle is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who looks like he's just eaten Holbrooke for breakfast, which he practically has. Brzezinski saw Holbrooke as a rival and a threat and did everything he could to humiliate him, kept him out of meetings, left him at the back of the motorcade, and told people at a meeting, carried a silver platter around and said, "I have Richard Holbrooke's head on this platter." And Holbrooke, from his face, clearly is getting the worst of it, although he was himself a pretty tough bureaucratic infighter. But one thing I learned in following his career is just how harsh and brutal bureaucratic combat can become, and how much foreign policy, Chris alluded to this in his opening talk, how much foreign policy comes down to human character, and how much relations between flawed human beings determine events of historic importance. We'd like to think that it's all happening on some level of strategy and abstract thinking. It's not. It's happening because people without enough information and with too much ambition are maneuvering to get the ear of the people above them and to lock out the people alongside them. And sometimes it happens because no decision is made at all, because events outrun the people making decisions. Between jobs in government, Holbrooke worked on Wall Street, made a lot of money, spent a lot of money, but really he lived for power and for government service. And the peak of his career came in the 90s, during the period when America was the lone superpower. And Holbrooke saw that moment as his moment. And he used it to push Bill Clinton, after years of delay, to intervene in Bosnia and to end a war that the European countries had been unable to end. Here he is in a protracted negotiation with Slobodan Milosevic, two rogue card players taking the measure of each other at Dayton. And Holbrooke did get that peace treaty, which was very flawed and remains a kind of albatross around Bosnia today, but which ended the war and ended the killing and his claim to greatness, if he has one. His last turn of the wheel came under Obama. Look at the body language. Obama doesn't want to look at Holbrooke. Biden is staring daggers at Holbrooke. And Holbrooke looks uncharacteristically uneasy behind that sofa. Why? Because for reasons he could never fathom, this great new president whom he so admired despised him. And I'll tell you a quick story. When Obama was elected president, he had heard bad things about Holbrooke from some of Holbrooke's many enemies whom he'd acquired over the years. But he had so few real talented people in foreign policy that he had to call Holbrooke to Chicago and interview him for a job, even though he really had no job for him. Within a minute, Holbrooke made 3 mistakes. First, he handed Obama a signed copy of his own book on how he ended the war in Bosnia, which is sort of normal Washington self-promotion, but with Obama, I think it was a mistake. Second, he interrupted Obama and said, "Do you mind, Mr. President, calling me Richard, not Dick? My wife, Kati, prefers for people to call me Richard." So he corrected Obama. And the third thing he did was began to get teary-eyed and then explained to Obama, "You don't have to be African American to cry." In other words, just being here with you, with our first black president, has moved me so much that there are tears in my eyes. I think anyone who had any sense of Obama would have known, don't do that. That's not what he wants. He wants to interview you about foreign policy. But within a minute, Holbrooke had shown flattery, self-display, self-promotion, and a kind of weakness. And I think that was it. He had lost Obama. He still got a job. And the reason was Hillary Clinton, who was his only real friend and supporter in the administration. She cared about him, she loved him, and she needed him, and they were very close, a really fascinating relationship. And she insisted that he get the job, and Obama said, "Fine, give him Afghanistan." That was sort of like, we'll see how long he lasts at that. Well, Holbrooke knew it was the hardest job there was, but he could not resist it because he needed to be in the arena. But from the beginning, Obama made it clear he didn't like Holbrooke. He left him off Air Force One on trips to Kabul, of all places. He would tell people in the Situation Room while Holbrooke was pontificating on the video screen, Obama would whisper around the table, "Who talks like that?" So he signaled to the top people in his cabinet that he didn't like him. Holbrooke was the last to find out, and that goes back to what I wrote about in the prologue about his blindness to himself. He was a very shrewd student of other people, except in relation to himself. He could not understand that they saw right through him. And Obama saw through him and thought, this guy's a flatterer. He's lecturing me about Vietnam all the time, as if Afghanistan is Vietnam, which, by the way, it is. Obama didn't want to hear that. And so Holbrooke was locked out, spent 2 years trying to get a meeting with Obama that never happened. And on December 10th, 2010, he was sitting in Hillary Clinton's office, the Secretary of State's office, the office he had always wanted for himself, but had always just missed because of himself. And suddenly his face turned bright red, and Hillary Clinton said, "Richard, my God, what's happening?" And what was happening was his aorta had just ripped open, and the blood was beginning to flow down into his extremities, and he was rushed to the hospital. And in that last hour, which I've tried to describe in the book in minute-by-minute detail, he was more himself fully than ever. He was screaming in pain. He was complaining about the service, the ambulance. He was telling his aide to write down his every word. And he was finally, I think, maybe for the first and last time in his life, really confronting himself, his mortality. And he died after 20 hours of surgery at age 69, I would say, in action and of a broken heart. As a man, he was flamboyant, maddening, mesmerizing. He wanted to swallow life whole. He was a bit of a star fucker. He had a 7-year affair with Diane Sawyer, which she finally escaped, totally exhausted, by meeting Mike Nichols and going off to marry him, which hurt Holbrooke's ego, I think, more than his heart. He loved adventure. He ate too much. He hung out with NBA players when he was Clinton's UN ambassador. He poked the Dalai Lama in the chest and told him what was what. He schmoozed with his buddy Robert De Niro and other movie stars. He had to have his hand in everything. And if he didn't think you were of much importance, he would look over your shoulder very quickly for someone more interesting to talk to and drop you cold and go off to that other person. His life reminds me of one of those protagonists in the great 19th century novels, making their way up through the Imperial Center, trying to prevail against an adversarial world. He was a horrible sexist, but he also was more himself with women than with anyone. And so in the book, I've gone on at great length about his relations with his wives. There were 3 of them. He never made it to the top. He never achieved all that he thought he could. He had egotism and idealism in immense quantities. The egotism made people detest him. The idealism made people revere him. He had elements of corruption in his life, toward the end especially. Sweetheart loans, $100,000 paid speeches in Kiev, sponsored by Viktor Pinchuk, the oligarch. He was part of that self-dealing that set in Washington at elite levels, and that I think can be said to have paved the way in part for Donald Trump. But he was also one of the few Americans at the top who really did care about people around the world. And as much as he could be brutally indifferent to those who he didn't consider worth his time, I sometimes think he never listened more closely to anyone than to a Pakistani refugee who had lost his home in a flood. He cared about refugees throughout his career, from Vietnam and Cambodia to Bosnia to Pakistan. He was the son of Jewish refugees himself, refugees from Hitler and Stalin, although Holbrooke spent his entire life sort of denying that he was Jewish. He was critical of the militarization of our foreign policy, but he also believed that America was a force for good. He believed this not as an idea he arrived at, but as an idea he was born with. It was just the air he breathed. He believed that America always had to get involved, to be in the lead, or problems would not get solved, and eventually they would become America's problems. And who better to lead the country in the lead than himself? The results were as often harmful as they were positive. This is a story that begins in Vietnam and ends in Afghanistan. And the lessons of the American century are, I think, ambiguous ones. I'm going to skip a bit through his tortured relationship with his friend-turned-enemy, Anthony Lake. You can read all about it in the book. And I'm going to end with a little bit of audio from the diary he kept at the end of his life. You'll hear it in his voice. He's dying. He's 3 months away from death. And in this diary bit, he's not talking about Afghanistan. He's describing an outing to see South Pacific, the musical, revived at Lincoln Center. And for me, it's maybe the most powerful of all his diary entries, so I wanted you to listen to it.
Monday, August 23rd, 7 a.m. Yesterday, the 22nd, Katya and I went to the final performance of the revival of South Pacific at Lincoln Center with Frank Rich and Alex Witchell and Linda Janklow. It was a fantastic afternoon in the theater, maybe the best ever. The fantastic production, which I found immensely moving. Men were crying, myself included. I tried to understand why that show had such an enormous emotional impact on us. For me, it was the combination of the beauty of the show and its music, and the capturing in that show of so many moments in American history. The show itself, opening in New York and the height of New York's greatness, 1949. The theme, Americans at war in a distant land or islands in the South Pacific. The sense of loss of American optimism and our feeling that we could do anything. The contrast with today. It was very powerful. And I kept thinking of where we were today, our nation. Our lack of confidence in our own ability to lead compared to where we were in 1949 when it came out, evoking an era only 5 years or 7 years earlier, when we had gone to the most distant corners of the globe and saved civilization.
Though Holbrooke was a diplomat, this is not really a book about foreign policy. It's a character study in ambition and a portrait of an era in American life, the era when America thought it could do anything. And like Holbrooke, the American century combined heroic and destructive impulses, nobility and hubris, the sense that we could do anything, and the impulse to do everything. But I really only understood what the book was about 6 years after Holbrooke died, on election night in 2016, when I suddenly realized that the era he embodied was over. And we were entering something new, something diminished. And I understood that what I was writing was now history.